The village of Santa Lucia rested quietly between the mountains. Every morning, mist rolled down the hills like a slow river, slipping between narrow streets and stone houses that had stood there for generations. The church bell rang at 6 o'clock sharp, just as it had for more than 100 years. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there. People woke early. Farmers walked toward the fields. Children crossed the square on their way to school. And every morning, before the sun touched the rooftops, Miguel opened his bakery. The warm smell of bread usually filled the village long before most people were awake. But lately, the bakery felt different. 3 months earlier, Miguel's wife Elena had died after a long illness. Since that day, the world had continued moving forward, but something inside him had stopped. The bakery oven still burned. Customers still came for bread, but the joy that once lived in the small shop had faded. Each morning Miguel worked quietly, speaking little, moving through the same routine simply because routine was easier than grief. One cold spring morning, he arrived earlier than usual. The square was still dark. Street lamps cast small pools of yellow light across the stone pavement, and the church stood silent in the gray mist. As Miguel unlocked the bakery door, something caught his attention. Someone was sitting on the steps of the church. A woman. She wore a pale blue cloak that rested softly over her shoulders. Her dark hair moved gently in the morning breeze. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching the closed church doors. Miguel assumed she was a traveler. People sometimes passed through the village on their way into the mountains. Still, something about her presence felt unusual. Not strange, just peaceful. Miguel stepped inside the bakery and lit the oven, but every few minutes he found himself looking through the window toward the square. The woman had not moved, and as the first light of dawn slowly crept over the mountains, Miguel decided to walk across the square. Miguel crossed the quiet square slowly. The stones beneath his feet were still wet from the night mist, and the air smelled faintly of pine drifting down from the mountains. The woman remained seated on the church steps. She looked up as he approached. Her face carried a calm expression, not distant, not curious, simply present, as if she had been waiting for him to walk across the square. "You wake early," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, but it carried clearly through the quiet morning air. Miguel nodded. "Bakers don't have much choice," he replied. The woman glanced toward the bakery window where the warm glow of the oven flickered through the glass. "You bring comfort to people," she said. Miguel shrugged. "It's just bread." The woman smiled faintly. Bread can mean hope to someone who is hungry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sky above the mountains was beginning to turn pale gold as the first sunlight crept toward the village rooftops. Miguel sat down on the lower step of the church. "You're not from here," he said. "No," the woman answered. "Traveling?" "Yes." Her answers were simple, but they felt thoughtful, as if each word had been chosen carefully. Miguel rubbed his hands together against the cool morning air. "My wife used to sit here," he said quietly, nodding toward the church steps. "She liked watching the sunrise from this spot." The woman listened. "She died this winter," Miguel continued. The words still felt strange each time he said them. For a moment the woman said nothing. Then she spoke gently. "I know." Miguel looked up quickly. "You know?" The woman's eyes held a depth that made the quiet morning feel even stiller. "She is safe," she said. The certainty in her voice felt different from the polite reassurances people often offered. Miguel felt his chest tighten. "How could you know that?" he asked. The woman looked toward the growing light over the hills. "A mother recognizes sorrow when she sees it," she said softly. Miguel lowered his eyes. Something about her presence made the weight he carried feel lighter, not gone, but easier to hold. "I don't know how to keep going without her," he admitted. The woman stood slowly. The church bell began to ring across the square, its deep tone echoing through the mist. "You continue the same way you always have," she said. Miguel looked up at her. "How?" The woman turned toward him. "By loving the people still in front of you." The words settled into the quiet morning like the first warm light of sunrise. The church bell continued ringing across the village. Its deep echo rolled through the narrow streets and drifted into the surrounding hills, just as it had every morning for more than a century. Miguel sat quietly on the stone step. The woman stood beside him, looking toward the mountains where the first sunlight had begun touching the peaks. For the first time in months, Miguel noticed how beautiful the morning looked. The mist was lifting slowly from the valley. Birds were beginning to circle above the rooftops. A thin line of golden light stretched across the horizon. It felt peaceful, something he had almost forgotten how to feel. "You loved her very much," the woman said softly. Miguel nodded. "She was the reason the bakery existed," he said. "The reason I woke up early every morning." The woman listened without interrupting. Miguel stared at the square. "I still wake up early," he continued quietly. "But now it just feels empty." The woman stepped down one step closer to him. "Love never disappears," she said gently. Miguel frowned slightly. "It feels like it does." "No," she replied. "It changes." Miguel looked at her. The calm in her voice felt deeper than simple comfort. "Where does it go?" he asked. She glanced toward the bakery across the square where the oven light still glowed through the window. "It becomes the kindness you give others." Miguel followed her gaze. The village was beginning to wake now. A farmer walked slowly across the square. A woman opened the shutters of her home. Smoke began rising from chimneys. Life continuing. The woman turned back toward him. "Your wife's love did not end," she said. "It lives in what you choose to do with the life you still have." Miguel felt something shift inside his chest. Not a sudden miracle, but a quiet understanding. "You speak like you've carried sorrow too," he said. For a moment the woman's eyes reflected something deeper, a memory older than the village, older than the mountains themselves. "I once watched my son suffer," she said softly. Miguel looked at her carefully. Her words were simple, but the meaning behind them was vast. A strange recognition stirred inside him. The pale blue cloak, the calm presence, the quiet compassion. Before he could speak again, the church bell stopped ringing. The square fell silent. The woman stepped away from the church steps and began walking slowly toward the road that led into the hills. "Wait," Miguel said, rising to his feet. She paused and looked back at him. "Who are you?" he asked. The sunlight had now reached the square, illuminating her face in warm golden light. She smiled gently. "A mother," she said. Then she turned and continued walking into the morning mist. Miguel stood there watching until her figure disappeared along the mountain road. And slowly, he began to understand. Miguel remained standing in the village square long after the woman disappeared into the mist. The mountains were glowing now in the full light of morning. The narrow streets were beginning to fill with people starting their day. A farmer guided his cart past the church. Children crossed the square laughing on their way to school. Life continued, just as it always had. But something inside Miguel had changed. He looked toward the road that led into the hills where the woman had walked. "A mother," he whispered. The words echoed quietly in his mind. Slowly, he turned and walked back toward the bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the square as the oven warmed inside. For the first time in months, the familiar scent didn't feel empty. It felt comforting. Miguel opened the door and stepped inside. Soon the first customers began arriving. Old Marta from the corner house came for her morning loaf. A young boy arrived with coins in his hand for sweet rolls before school. A farmer stopped in for bread before heading to the fields. Miguel greeted each of them with something he hadn't offered in a long time: a smile. Later that morning, a neighbor entered the bakery and noticed the change. "You seem different today," she said. Miguel paused. "I think I spoke with someone this morning," he replied. "Who?" Miguel glanced toward the church steps across the square. "A mother." The neighbor laughed softly, assuming he meant someone from another village. But Miguel knew what he had seen. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, he closed the bakery and stepped outside. The square was quiet again. He walked slowly to the church steps where the woman had been sitting at dawn. For a moment he stood there, listening to the wind move through the village streets. Then he whispered quietly, "Thank you." A gentle breeze moved across the square. Miguel smiled. From that day forward, the bakery of Santa Lucia felt warm again. The people of the village noticed it, though none of them knew why. And sometimes, early in the morning when the mist rolled down from the mountains, travelers passing through the hills would later say they had seen a woman in a pale blue cloak walking the narrow road above the village. She never stayed long. She never spoke loudly. But wherever she appeared, people said the same thing afterward. The world felt lighter. Because somewhere, on quiet roads and silent village squares, the mother who once stood beneath a cross still walked among those who needed hope. Not always with miracles that changed the world, but often with something even greater. A quiet reminder that no sorrow is unseen,